This episode of the Christian Chronicle podcast is brought to you by Hope for Haiti's Children. From the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, we know the story of a time when thousands of people gathered in the wilderness for days to listen to Jesus preach and teach. Jesus' disciples come to him and say, "Send these people away. They need something to eat. They're starving." What does Jesus tell his disciples to do? You give them something to eat. Doesn't matter to Jesus that all the food the disciples have on hand is barely enough to feed one person. Jesus turns that one sack lunch into enough food to feed the entire crowd and still have enough for seconds. You give them something to eat. Hope for Haiti's Children Lunch Club obeys that order from Jesus. For just $10 a month, you can provide daily meals for school children in Haiti. And that's not just food for their bellies. You know, it's hard for a mind to learn when a stomach is empty. You'll be giving children food for their bodies and food for their thoughts at the same time. Think about it. $10 won't even buy you a value meal anymore in the United States, but that same amount can feed a school child in Haiti for days on end. So what are you going to do? Children in Haiti are hungry. You give them something to eat. Join the Hope for Haiti's Children Lunch Club today. Go to thelunchclub.org. That's THE, thelunchclub.org. Link in the show notes. Hope for Haiti's Children. Family and friends, neighbors, and most of all, strangers, welcome to the Christian Chronicle podcast. We're bringing you voices that speak to ideas, issues, and stories that Church of Christ congregations and members encounter today as they seek to practice the life of Jesus Christ in the places where God plants them around the world. I'm B.T. Irwin. May what you are about to hear honor God and illuminate you. Imagine a time before the internet. You're a Church of Christ family planning a vacation to a different part of the country. Say you're from somewhere up north and you're going to the beach in Florida for a whole week. And you know you'll be there when Sunday comes around, and you know you need to be in church. After all, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Like I said, this is a time before the internet. What do you do when you want to find the local Church of Christ in a place you've never visited? Well, my parents always reached for a big book on the church library shelf. They always reached for the latest edition of Churches of Christ in the United States. Published every year, Churches of Christ in the United States claimed to comprise a directory of every Church of Christ congregation in the 50 states and U.S. territories. Going to, say, Buffalo, New York. Just flip to the New York section and let your fingers do the walking to Buffalo. And there you would find a listing of Church of Christ congregations in Buffalo with addresses and phone numbers. And you'd also find the number of members each congregation claimed, as well as other information to help you decide if you would be comfortable as a visitor. For example, I knew my conservative parents would not be taking us to any Church of Christ congregation with the letter I next to its listing. If you know, you know. Churches of Christ in the United States got a lot more use than just serving as a companion to AAA travel guides for families planning vacations in the mid to late 20th century. Church planters used it to locate cities ripe for new congregations. Colleges with ties to the Church of Christ used it to promote conferences and lectureships and to recruit students. Reporters and scholars used it to track the health and size of the Church of Christ community. And I was just as much a nerd then as I am now. When I was in elementary school, I used to pass the time going through Churches of Christ in the United States to do things like find the biggest and smallest congregations in each state, or rank the states from the one that had the fewest congregations to the one that had the most. Spoiler alert, I think Texas won for the total number, but Tennessee won for the total number per square mile. Yeah. If you've never even heard of Churches of Christ in the United States, it's because the last one rolled off the press back in 2018, almost 8 years ago now. Work was underway to publish a new one until the pandemic of 2020 to 2021 put a stop to it. In 2024, the Church Research Council, a new partnership between the Christian Chronicle, Heritage 21 Foundation, the Seibert Institute at Abilene Christian University, and 21st Century Christian, announced plans to compile and publish a new Churches of Christ in the United States. But now, in its second year of the project, the Church Research Council is finding that Making an accurate directory of Church of Christ congregations is a lot harder than it seems, starting with the fact that anywhere from 10,000 to 12,000 independent and sometimes isolated congregations are hard to track down. And that's before they choose to answer the phone or agree to cooperate, which some of them will not do. And then there's the question of which congregations qualify for listing in the directory. Among our loose confederation of independent congregations, the word disfellowship is fairly common. I've lived in a small town where 4 congregations had Church of Christ on their signs out front, and every one of them deemed the other 3 to be unfit for the book of life, not to mention Churches of Christ in the United States. So choosing which Church of Christ congregations make it into the directory may, to some, whiff of dreaded denominationalism, or even worse, sitting in judgment like God. The Christian Chronicle's own Cheryl Mann Bacon wrote an excellent piece on the challenges and considerations of publishing a new Churches of Christ in the United States. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Meanwhile, we have with us today a member of the project's planning and research team. Dr. Suzie Macaluso directs research for the Seibert Institute at Abilene Christian University and is leading the research for Churches of Christ in the United States. A sociologist and statistician by trade, Dr. Macaluso has focused her entire academic career on learning how to research congregational growth and health. In other words, she is the perfect guest to nerd out with us on what goes into making a directory of Church of Christ congregations. Dr. Macaluso, I don't know if I've ever been this excited about a guest on the show. Thank you for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I don't know if you were a kid like me who could be happy passing the time analyzing a directory like Churches of Christ in the United States. And even if you weren't, I reckon that you had to study a few of these to get ready for the Church Research Council project. So what about those old Churches of Christ in the United States directories fascinates you?
Yeah, so was very nerdy as a child, but I didn't grow up in Churches of Christ, so I wasn't familiar with the directory. But as a student at Cascade College, my senior year, I did a research project where I wanted to survey Church of Christ leadership about why people leave Churches of Christ. And so for that project, we used the directory, and I sent letters, physical mail, to all of the Churches of Christ in the state of Oregon. And then through that, that was my first exposure to the directory and basically its usefulness, right? That you would have this thing that gives you information about all of the churches in the US and the territories in a way that is accessible for everyone. And it hadn't really occurred to me that people would use it when traveling until later on, once I was more established in Churches of Christ. But as a researcher, just that fact that we had some sort of sampling frame to draw from just really was exciting to me, because not very many groups have that.
I didn't really think about this until the Christian Chronicle got involved with the Church Research Council in this project. You know, you're making a directory of Church of Christ congregations, locations, addresses. That doesn't seem like a hard thing, but it turns out that it's a lot harder than it sounds. So why is that?
This should be fairly straightforward, right? You contact everyone on the list, you ask them for updates, you learn if anyone is closed, and that seems very straightforward. But then we pulled Carl Royster into the conversation, and Carl very kindly didn't laugh at us, but wanted to be real with us about how challenging this would be. We've heard from over 25% of the churches that we think exist. Is pretty incredible. The main challenge is really the divisions that exist within Churches of Christ. In terms of the streams and the divisions that exist, there's this hesitancy to participate in anything that looks denominational, anything that strikes someone as institutional in that way, because of that firm foundation of independence and non-denominationalism that exists. And so there are a lot of churches that will just they don't want to respond because they don't want to participate in something that looks institutional in that way. And then the second piece that I don't think people think about as often is our size. So on average, our congregations are much smaller than your average congregation in the United States. We have more small congregations than most denominations do. So that is challenging because when you have a very small congregation, a lot of times those addresses then are personal home addresses.
Yeah.
Or they are P.O. boxes. I had thought about the streams, right? I was very aware of some of those divisions within Churches of Christ. But this idea about small churches was challenging. And so that's something we have to like think about and have had to be intentional.
One of the things that I've become aware of working at the Christian Chronicle over the last 3 years is being a Church of Christ congregation is a self-selecting activity. You understand what I'm saying? Individual congregations being autonomous, as we say, choose to identify as a Church of Christ. And they also then kind of get to choose congregations that they're willing to fellowship with, as we say, and those that they don't fellowship with. And so not only does that create the problem that you just described for putting together a directory, but the very act of creating a directory of Church of Christ congregations in the United States is that I guess, and you can correct me, you're going to include some congregations that actually don't want to be in the directory, right?
We want to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible. And so we don't really have a definition of Church of Christ. If you consider your church Church of Christ, then they can be included. So there are a number of churches that have dropped the Church of Christ kind of component of their name, but in their practices are still very much kind of Churches of Christ. But then you also have a lot of church plants, right? Newer churches that don't have the Church of Christ name, but again, are planted by Churches of Christ. And in their structure and in their kind of function, look very much like a Church of Christ. And so we want to make sure that those get included. But we also recognize that there are churches that dropped the name maybe for a reason and don't want to be associated with Churches of Christ. And we also want to respect that. And then there are the Churches of Christ that don't really want to be associated with any sort of larger faith tradition or movement, or however you want to think about it, right? Outside of kind of that denomination term, because we're not really a denomination. And so what do you do about those churches? Do you not include them? Because that doesn't feel accurate. And so that becomes a bit of a challenge where one of the strategies that we used was asking folks from the various streams to participate in the leadership of the Church Research Council and of this project, asking them to advocate on behalf of this project with the churches that they fellowship with. And I think that helped quite a bit.
How have y'all on the team worked through the implications of making these choices? We're doing, I'm going to put it this way, making a directory is kind of a denominational thing to do, but we're doing it for non-denominations, you know?
My thinking was, well, if you have a denomination like that, you have a list. Like that should be pretty easy. What I have discovered is that it is actually not as easy as it appears. But none of my colleagues would say that it's easy to get people to respond to anything. There is this tendency, and I think this might be a little bit of an American thing, of wanting that independence, even if you belong to a larger tradition. And I think for Churches of Christ, just like amplify that by like 100, and that's us. But that's like one of the things that is the most beautiful thing about Churches of Christ is that autonomy. Church
of Christ is an appropriate name for the Lord's church, but so is Disciples of Christ or Christian Church, if anybody knows a little bit about our history. So one of my fascinations then has been over the years at the Christian Chronicle, we'll report on a Church of Christ congregation that changes its name. And you touched on this a little while ago. And then the follow-up question to that is, how does the Church Research Council decide whether those congregations have maybe changed so much in other ways that they no longer fit in this group?
So in that kind of this phase that we're in now, where individuals are personally calling churches that we don't know if they still exist or not, right? Trying to just find out if they exist. If in that phone conversation, someone says, yeah, we don't want to be included in the Church of Christ directory because we don't think of ourselves as a Church of Christ anymore. That's all. Then you're not a Church of Christ. It's up to the individual congregation. But then there are churches who have said, well, is this for us? Because they've dropped the name, but they're questioning, like, do you consider us a Church of Christ? And our response is, yeah, if you would like to be included, we want to include you. And so that's like a really weird, squishy place to be. There's not a good, like, firm answer as to these groups are in, these churches are out, because it's so situational.
When you encounter congregations that did not grow out of the Stone Campbell movement, the Restoration movement, they came off from somewhere else and they are claiming to be non-denominational and restoring New Testament Christianity. Do they have a place in this directory? For over 70 years, the African Christian Schools Foundation has been supporting church planting and evangelism in Africa. And if the explosive growth of the church in Africa is any indicator, the hand of God has been on the African Christian Schools Foundation all that time. Maybe you're already a supporter of the African Christian Schools Foundation, or maybe Africa or a particular people or place in Africa stir love in your heart. If so, please accept this invitation to attend the annual African Violet Dinner on April 9 at the Green Hills Church of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee. You'll enjoy the company of many other Christians who love being part of what God is doing in Africa through the African Christian Schools Foundation. And you'll hear a report from Brother Hiram Kemp, who just returned from a visit to churches and schools in Nigeria. Make your reservation at africanchristianschools.org. That's africanchristianschools.org. Link in the show notes. That's the African Violet Dinner to benefit the African Christian Schools Foundation, April 9 in Nashville, Tennessee, africanchristianschools.org.
That's a great question.
Because that could get really messy.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to maybe tradition and our legacy has more to do with our identity than we want to admit. Because I think it is a very important factor here.
Let me be a sociologist for a second.
That's what
so the whole, all of this kind of stems back to definition, right? Mm-hmm. And we started in this non-denominational space where anything can be a Church of Christ. It's not really, the name doesn't matter, right? That's what we would have said in the beginning. But over time, what has happened is that we have socially constructed this group and this identity, right? So identity comes from interactions with others, right? And how we identify ourselves is based in our relationships with others and with our environment. And so it's through the relationships that we have with other folks and trying to, like, what do we have in common, right? How do we connect? And then that creates then this identity as a Church of Christ. I grew up in a non-denominational church that I would say would be more closely associated with Calvary Chapel.
Yeah.
Kind of tradition, West Coast surfer vibes, but they didn't want to be a Calvary Chapel. So they didn't want to be a branch, right? Or like a church within that denomination. They very much looked like a Calvary Chapel. So should we be listed as a Calvary Chapel? No, we shouldn't, because we don't identify that way. We don't affiliate that way. We don't go to those conferences, right? So if there is a non-denominational church that kind of looks Church of Christ-ish, my bet is someone there who started that church came out of Churches of Christ. If there is a church that looks Church of Christ-ish, if they weren't in the directory before, the only way we're going to know about them is if someone tells us. And if someone tells us, then they're probably in the Churches of Christ, and somehow they ran across this church. So there's going to be some sort of connection, some sort of pathway that connects the two. And if that's a strong enough pathway, then we would say, yeah, would you like to be included? And if they say yes, they're included. If there's not, then we're not going to ever run across them. And so they're going to remain kind of this independent thing.
But you said a moment ago, looks Church of Christ-ish. Well, what does that mean? Lifelong Church of Christ folks that have been around since, mid to late 20th century like me, when we say looks Church of Christ-ish, we mean, well, it looks like the Bible. It looks like the Church of the New Testament.
Oh, see, and that's not what I do say.
Okay.
That's not how I interpret that.
When you say looks Church of Christ-ish, people who have grown up in the Church of Christ and know the Church of Christ, I guarantee you their brain does not automatically go to the New Testament.
Yeah.
It goes to something that they hold in their memory.
Yeah.
They imagine something that, has a certain flavor to it and a certain story and a certain tradition and a certain language.
So when I say Church of Christ-ish, I'm thinking about what are those beliefs and practices which bring us into community. And so when I think about that, I think about communion, but I'm not just thinking about the tradition of taking communion. I'm thinking about the why, right? The belief that we have about why we would take communion every single Sunday. I think about baptism, and not just that we baptize adults, right? But why? What are the reasons? And where does that come from, right? So it's the act, but it's also the belief behind the act. One of the things that has defined Churches of Christ for a long time is worship style, right? And a cappella singing. So then what do you do with Churches of Christ that have instruments?
Right.
So then you have to think about, okay, so there's the practice, right? The practice is, how are you worshiping? But then there is also like the belief behind it, right? And what is at the core of that? And so it depends on who you ask, right? There are people who will say if you use instruments, you're no longer a Church of Christ. But if you talk to folks who are in Churches of Christ that now use instruments, it's not because they no longer believe that a cappella worship is sufficient. It's because they're trying to meet some sort of need that they're seeing in the spiritual lives of their membership. And so just because someone does the same thing as us doesn't mean that it is the same.
Yeah.
Because the meaning behind it has to matter. So there's two ways to think about the directory, right? There's should we include XYZ church? But then there's also, what are people actually using the directory for? A big part of that directory is helping people to know where to go when they're traveling, if they're going to move somewhere, or if something happens and they happen to be near a Church of Christ, like who do they call for help? Yeah. It's kind of one of those things, kind of a network sort of situation. But if there's a non-denominational church that your grandmother would never go to, which I can guarantee you there are quite a few, then I wouldn't include them, right? So like there's this how are we using the directory, as well as thinking about the criteria, right? Or the gatekeeping.
Some of those non-denominational churches, my grandmama would never visit, and that's true. But I can also say that there are a lot of Church of Christ congregations that my grandmama would not visit, and she would know not to visit them by reading Churches of Christ in the United States. Yep. There was a key inside the front cover with a bunch of letters, and these letters would tell you what you would find at a congregation if you decided to visit. So, for example, I think the letter I could be wrong. Somebody will surely email me if I'm getting this wrong. The letter I next to a congregation's name meant that the congregation worshiped with instruments. I believe NI was non-institutional. What has happened, I think, for a lot of folks, like my grandmama is a good example, she's not going to visit a congregation that has an I next to the name. And she might not even consider it a congregation of the Lord's church for that reason. These letter indicators, these letter designations, kind of for us are more than just what to expect when visiting. They become markers of who's in and who's out, who's a true congregation of the Lord's church and who is, you might say an imposter or fallen. So I imagine the diversity of practices and teachings among Church of Christ congregations is far greater than it was in the 1980s and 1990s, and even in the 2010s. Are there going to be some new letter designations, if you have letter designations, and are you adding any new ones from years ago?
There will definitely be letter designations. I'm pretty sure we'll keep all of the ones that historically we've had, but we haven't really discussed if there would be any additional ones. I think there could be a case for a distinction between kind of a more traditional worship style and perhaps a more contemporary worship style, but we haven't really fleshed out. We know that within what we would consider mainstream, there are several distinctive groups. And how we designate that is kind of where we're at right now. We're in conversation about what does that mean, and does that need to be identified in the directory? Well, and maybe this is where it's helpful to see things in kind of an aggregated report versus a listing of individual congregations, right? So it's maybe more helpful to more folks for us to know like what % of congregations identify as contemporary. It's up for interpretation, right? Like that's the problem. It's all up to interpretation and kind of where is your baseline of comparison as to what is traditional and what is contemporary.
Yeah. And if you're asking people, are you contemporary? It's completely subjective.
Exactly.
Someone may think they're contemporary and they're not. I remember something like the language was B equals Black Church of Christ. Like I'm quoting that right there. B equals Black Church of Christ, implying that the Black Church of Christ is not the same as the Church of Christ. Yeah. So in more recent years, I've heard folks point to Churches of Christ in the United States and its letter designations as a contributor to what we might call the dismemberment of the body of Christ as it relates to Black and white Christians, as if it's two separate churches rather than one. So how is the Church Resource Council handling this in the new directory?
Yeah, this is a really important question because the experiences, so I would term them historically Black Churches of Christ, kind of like you would talk about historically Black colleges and universities. Quite honestly, those churches came about because of segregation that was happening in the white churches. Like we don't want to negate that history and downplay the effects of segregation and Jim Crow, especially on a denomination or a tradition that is primarily in the South. The experiences of those congregations and the members of those congregations shouldn't be minimized or washed over. So like there is this like difficult balance that has to happen between allowing that designation or some signifier that this congregation has a special history and a special past, but also not adding to divisiveness.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to think about. And I'm not sure what the right answer is, because I don't think I'm the person who needs to make that decision. I think this is a place where folks like me, if you're listening to this, I'm white, listen to our brothers and sisters who are Black, are African American, listen to their stories and what they prefer, right? And then follow their lead.
This seems to be a theme in this conversation because we have 10 to 12,000 congregations all over the country, and they reflect their local cultures and customs. And yet there are things that tie us together. When Cheryl Mann Bacon interviewed you for her story, you told her the thing that motivates you to be part of this project is you want to know, quote, who we are, end quote. What have you learned about that so far?
I used to think that wherever I went, if I walked into a Church of Christ, I pretty much know what I was going to get. But at the same time, while we might look similar on the outside in our practices, there's a lot of variety. And I think a lot of that has to do with culture. Whatever your style or preference is, we can all worship in a way that feels authentic to us, but also is seeking to be like that New Testament church or one of those New Testament churches, right? Because there was still variety there. There's not one way of being. And so that's really kind of fun for me to see and been really encouraging that it's not this monolithic thing that we've thought that it was. We don't all think the same. We don't all do things exactly the same way. So there's consistency, but there's also diversity, and that's kind of cool.
It is cool. And we'll stop right there. Dr. Suzie Macaluso is one of the lead researchers on the epic mission to publish a new edition of Churches of Christ in the United States after an 8-year absence and counting. She is director of research for the Seibert Institute at Abilene Christian University, which, along with the Christian Chronicle, Heritage 21, and 21st Century Christian, make up the Church Research Council, the partnership behind Churches of Christ in the United States. Dr. Macaluso, I could do this all day, but I got to stop and eat. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.
We hope that something you heard in this episode encouraged, enlightened, or enriched you in some way. If it did, thanks be to God, and please pay it forward. Subscribe to this podcast and share it with a friend. Recommend and review it wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Your subscription, recommendation, and review help us reach more people. Please send your comments, ideas, and suggestions to podcast@christianchronicle.org. Don't forget, our ministry to inform and inspire Christians and congregations around the world is a nonprofit ministry that relies on your generosity. So if you like the show and you want to keep it going and make it even better, please make a tax-deductible gift to the Christian Chronicle at christianchronicle.org/donate. The Christian Chronicle podcast is a production of the Christian Chronicle Incorporated, informing and inspiring Church of Christ congregations, members, and ministries around the world since 1943. The Christian Chronicle's managing editor is Calvin Cockrell, editor-in-chief Bobby Ross Jr., and president and CEO Eric Trigestad. The Christian Chronicle podcast is written, directed, and hosted by B.T. Irwin and recorded in Detroit, Michigan, USA. Editing, show notes, and transcript services by Kinsey James. Mastering, mixing, and sound quality by James Flanagan. Until next time, may grace and peace be yours in abundance.